Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistanomy. My name is Uzair Yunus, and today we're going to be having a pretty interesting conversation, primarily because this is a topic that I've been thinking about, writing about, and having some frameworks developed around what it means for countries like Pakistan and what it means for the future of humanity as a whole. And that topic is artificial intelligence and where things are going to go as a result of the breakthrough innovations that we're seeing in the field of artificial intelligence and its impact on everything from robotics to agriculture. So, as I was starting my week, a dear friend Adil Husain published a Substack on his Substack called the Hussain Signal, which is titled "The Real AI Threat is a 27-year-old in Manila with GPT-5." And that immediately caught my eye, and I was like, let's read it and let's figure out where Adil's mind is at. And in many ways, it converged around my own thoughts around this topic. And so I figured it would be important to have Adil on this podcast to talk about this and get a bit deeper into his thinking around what AI means and what AI means in particular for young men and women in countries like the Philippines, Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. I've linked Adil's Substack in the description for those of you who want to read the full piece. But Adil, welcome to Pakistanomy, and thank you for taking out time today.
Thank you there. This is a dream come true. I've been waiting for this moment for years.
No, thank you for the flattery. But let's begin with perhaps the bigger question, right? And then we'll go towards your Substack and the deeper elements of that piece in just a moment. But, whether it's Washington, D.C., where you and I are based, or other parts of the world, one big question is, what does AI mean for jobs? And what
Mm,
does it mean in terms of labor policy, labor displacement,
mm.
careers, career trajectory, all sorts of questions from the macro to the micro are being asked with a lot of doom and gloom and
Yeah,
a lot of fear around them. How do you see AI and AI's effect on jobs, especially white collar jobs, in the near future, particularly given the pace at which this innovation is moving through the labor market?
yeah. Thanks there. So, look, I think we're witnessing already what some people are calling the white collar recession of 2025. And this is not about mass layoffs. It's about the collapse of certain kinds of career ladders and wage compression. Now, you can go and look at anecdotal information about what do graduating MBA classes from some of the top schools look like in terms of job offers received by this time in the year, this year, compared to last year, compared to 5 years ago or something, right? So this is happening all around at different levels of the economy. AI isn't yet replacing entire professions. What it is doing is it's carving up certain mid-level roles into more task fragments. And it's allowing those fragments to be executed faster, cheaper, and arguably, better in places around the world. Um, so that is the main sort of thesis of the article that I wrote that you mentioned, that this is not about uh, a whole scale replacement of the workforce, but it is about making it possible, even more than before, for a global AI augmented workforce to be, in some cases, leapfrogging domestic workers in higher wage economies.
So, I mean, this is interesting, right? You mentioned the MBA example,
Mm,
but I would even go undergrad finance, right? My undergrad major was finance, and one of the main jobs you did as a finance grad coming into the workforce, if you were going into investment banking or private equity or whatever, was you were an Excel monkey.
mm,
सारा दिन काम ही ये था कि आपने
right.
Excel models बनाने हैं, right? And over the last few months, I've been like looking at a bunch of like data that I work with, and I over the years because I grew up in and got into my career at a time when there were no other way to do Excel but yourself.
Mm,
Meant that I've been playing around with ChatGPT and cloud and other things, and it's fascinating how much data it can process and what visualizations it can do, etc., without anyone even having a basic understanding of Excel, right? If the data is structured, and even if it's unstructured, you can structure it using AI and go through that. So it is real, and I see it myself in my day to day. But
Mm.
then the question becomes, if you are facing this sort of like compression or task fragmentation, as you called it, where are the opportunities then for somebody coming out of the, you know, college education system or the MBA program of 2026, let's say, to find an opportunity, or how should they be thinking about what does this mean to enter an AI augmented labor market essentially?
That's a very big question, and I'm not sure I have the answer for you. But let me break this down by, where I think the risk is and where the opportunity is. I think the risk is in higher wage economies, and I think the opportunity is in lower wage economies. Because what AI is doing is it's breaking down what I call the context barrier, right? So in the past, the kind of things that could be um, offshored were more mechanical tasks with very clear standards and processes and instructions. Do this thing in this way so that it can be done somewhere else and can be done for less. And what AI is doing is that now that those roles where context is king, those can be trained into AI agents. And so the kind of things that required a high level of judgment now become a high level of pattern recognition. And that becomes scalable. So I think anything that was previously um, where it was the kind of thing where you might say, well, that's just too complicated to like delegate to somebody else, right? Where, I mean, you know, it's something that would require too much training and cultural knowledge and understanding um, and I don't just mean cultural in terms of like country to country, but even like cultural in terms of like how things work in my company and all this knowledge that people have about the way of doing certain things. This can now be communicated algorithmically, right, to anybody anywhere. And so I think that is really driving both the risk and the opportunity here.
So it's almost like this, right? Like, and this is such a key thing in the DC ecosystem, right? Like, okay, an analyst is going to write a piece of analysis on, tariff policy in Japan as a result of the ongoing trade war.
Yes.
And the firm that they work at is going to be like, well, we have a certain style of writing and we have a
Mm,
certain way of communicating.
mm,
And the point, if I hear you correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that, okay, in a pre-AI world, that mattered because that training mattered and that style and judgment and nuance mattered. But in a post-AI world, if you have 500 of these memos that can be sucked into an LLM,
yeah.
the IBA grad in Karachi or the Jawaharlal Nehru University grad in Delhi
Mm,
can pretty much write that same memo in that same tone, because the barrier was the tone and the nuance and the judgment. The data was always there available to them because they're as smart as anybody else, but they couldn't communicate in that context. And now AI is breaking down that barrier, which means that the $120,000 analyst sitting in Washington, D.C. can be disrupted by $20,000 a year Ajmal or Ashraf or, Ashok sitting in Delhi. Is that
that's
correct?
right. Yeah, and not only that, but they're not limited to working for just one firm with one style, right? Because you could have a different GPT for each firm that you're working with in this particular example, right? And so let's say Asia Group has a particular editorial style of how they produce things. And then, ASG or somebody else might have a different style and somebody else. And so all of these things could be essentially, placed into context heavy training for different AIs. And yes, in theory, a lot of this kind of work can be done elsewhere. But it's not just about content. It's not even just content creation. Think about somebody who's, writing onboarding processes. And in the past, for somebody to do that for their organization required a deep knowledge of the understanding of the organization, who does what, where, how things work, etc. And it's a a mid-level HR manager, let's say, who's putting something like that together. Now, all that context and knowledge can now be consolidated, and that mid-level HR job could, in theory, be done by somebody else who doesn't have 5 years or 15 years of experience in that organization, but they can still put together something pretty quickly that's pretty good enough, frankly, for most purposes. So think of what that does now to to this idea of the atomization of work.
Yeah, and that brings me to the bigger question I had, because this is, you mentioned that this is an opportunity for countries with lower wages, and sort of a younger workforce. But the broader conversation, when I look at it, that's going on in the media, in the ecosystem, even within those countries, is, oh shit, this means our IT coding jobs are going to go away, our outsourcing jobs are going to go away, our
Yeah.
call centers are going to go away because, again, AI agents who sound and act like humans can do the customer service call. How do you see that playing out in these markets as well?
Yeah, they're not wrong because it is a double-edged sword, especially for these outsourcing countries, India, Philippines, and others. Because if you stay in low-code grunt work, you're going to get automated out. That's already happening in the US, and it's going to happen elsewhere. So this is about moving up the value chain and being the person who's orchestrating the workflow to become indispensable. I think we're entering into this sort of prompt first services era. And in a way, it's an opportunity for countries like Pakistan that have been lagging way behind compared to other countries in terms of the IT industry and so forth. Because let's face it, despite what the government might say and platitudes and everything else, they're never going to catch up to India for the game that India has already won years ago, right? However, there's a new game now, and if a lot of these roles that require armies of programmers sitting around punching in code, if a lot of that is becoming obsolete and there's a new game in town, this is an opportunity not only for Pakistan but many other countries, including India, of course, to leapfrog that and to provide a completely different value proposition in terms of what can be done from other locations. So if you're sitting around doing JavaScript coding and this and that, like, yeah, maybe time's up now or in the near future. But if you can provide business services with that deep cultural context and understanding specific to an organization, specific to a region, a country, an industry, without having all the background that it was assumed is necessary for some of those roles, and you can do that now sitting anywhere, that is the opportunity.
Got it. And again, thinking out loud here, right? If I were to look at other sectors outside IT outsourcing or services oriented jobs,
Hmm.
my understanding or my assessment is that it's also an opportunity in other parts of the economy, let's say manufacturing, where you've been left behind. If you are even India, for example, right? Like manufacturing as a percent of GDP is not anywhere near where India should be, for example. Forget about Pakistan, it's even way behind. But a limitation to doing that was human capacity and knowledge. And AI systems and robotics now means that that knowledge base and that capability to execute in the same way that perhaps a Lego factory operating in Vietnam could operate at. That barrier is also falling because, again, it's decentralizing and atomizing the processes, the frameworks, the production mechanism, etc., provided you do the capital investments right and
Hmm.
have the ease of doing business parts of it right. Do you see this also playing out in the non-services sector of the economy, where, again, the countries that have fallen behind in the sort of like the industrial revolution era game can now catch up and leapfrog in an AI augmented manufacturing game almost?
I'm actually far less optimistic and I would say pessimistic on that thesis. Um, because I think what's actually going to happen on that front is much more reshoring. And it's not for the benefit that, let's say, the Trump administration is hoping for, that there'll be all these blue collar jobs created in the US. But instead, it's going to be much more, of these, I think dark factories, as they're known, where you basically don't need a light bulb on because it's just robots working in the background, right? Um, and so, with the tariffs and with the policy agenda that's being set in the U.S. at the moment, to the extent that it does drive back any reshoring, I think these are going to be heavily automated types of opportunities. And so I think this actually puts developing countries at a disadvantage.
Okay, interesting. And I'm guessing then the game for the developing country would be how do you then build a manufacturing ecosystem that does the same thing, which is reshoring for your own internal consumption base, which the problem there is your consumption base isn't large enough in terms of spending power. So now you're stuck over there. So that's going to be interesting to play out. Now I want to switch to DC and the US conversation, right?
Mm.
Because you also write about this in your Substack, is that the conversation is too US centric and it's missing the point about the fact that this middle layer of management or the middle layer of the workforce in the United States or Europe or other advanced economies can actually get rapidly displaced by people, as we're talking about, sitting in countries like Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Philippines, etc. What do you think is missing here in the AI conversation? What are people like even Mark Andreessen getting wrong about understanding the world and what it means right now?
Yeah. So the article I wrote was a critique of Mark's Substack that he wrote a few weeks ago, where he says that, look, there are certain parts of the economy that are just completely safe from AI because these roles are too highly regulated. And so if you look at the cost curve of those kinds of industries, on the other hand, on one hand, while um, sectors where the technology has had a huge impact on reducing the cost, um, that trends in one direction. And if you look at healthcare and education and some other industries, that goes in the totally opposite direction, with costs going up year by year. And so his thesis is that, look, um, forget about AI disrupting these things. These are just too highly regulated. So this whole thing about AI contributing to job loss is really overblown. And I think where he really misses the point is that he's looking at the world in a very narrow sense, very US-centric way, as if the impact of all of these things is limited by the borders of the country, which it isn't. Um, so there's a global labor arbitrage that's happening. And while it's true that for some time to come, the highest regulated roles that require the highest level of certifications and licensing and so forth in the highest regulated industries might need to be done in a certain location. There's a lot else in those same industries that doesn't require any of those protections, right? And so I don't think those industries are fundamentally immune to the risk of AI. Now, I combine that with the further, it's not just about AI, it's the AI times offshoring sort of dynamic, right? So that it isn't just a worker being replaced by a robot, but because in many cases you do need a human being who is um, doing some of that work for whatever reasons, right? The human judgment, etc. But AI is enabling potentially these types of roles to be shifted to anywhere in the world. And I think that's Mark Anderson doesn't address this at all. He's just comparing it to US worker versus US robot. And that's not the only comparison worth making.
No, I actually, that was one of the points you made that really resonated with me because we're already seeing that, for example, even pre-AI, right, with the rise of Fiverr and Upwork, was that, hey, I don't need to hire a graphics designer sitting in California to do really good work for me for $1,000. I can
Yeah.
hire somebody sitting in Ukraine to do that same work, same quality at a fraction of the price. And then if Ukraine's too expensive and I'm okay with a little bit less quality, I can go to different part, like go to Nigeria if I want. Again, Fiverr can optimize that for me, right?
Yeah.
And that was beginning to happen. Sorry,
So
go ahead.
but on the one hand, that Fiverr guy sitting in Ukraine or Nigeria or whatever, who's scraping, data from the web, or who's doing photo editing or podcast production, or all of these kind of things, those kind of roles are also at risk. And so all of the, all that Upwork, Fiverr type of market for these low-level tasks, which AI can do, they don't need somebody in those countries doing those things, because I can buy a subscription for $10 a month that'll do all of those things pretty quickly, right?
Yeah.
So it's not just a one-sided risk or
Yeah.
opportunity. There's a lot going on in both directions. Some things are not going to require your freelancer on Upwork any longer. And on the other hand, it's creating new opportunities.
And this was going to be my follow on to that point is, I get a lot of messages from particularly younger Pakistanis that are like, hey, how should we be thinking about our careers? What should we be studying or reading, etc. So if those folks are probably listening to this conversation and being like, Adil bhai, bata do na karna kya chahiye. So given this is a double-edged sword, how should they be thinking about their skills to really take advantage of the opportunity and not be caught on the wrong side of this trade, so to speak?
So I have a daughter who's a senior in high school. And last weekend, we were actually just visiting the college that she'll be attending in the fall. And so I've been thinking a lot about, what are the kind of things one needs to be studying for and training for the future, right? So whereas, you might have said going into technology or some STEM related thing is sort of um, the safe bet for the future. I'm not sure that's true anymore. Um, it's not just about programming. It's about many types of roles in technology and in the sciences that I think are going to be compressed by AI. So I don't know about you there. I went to a liberal arts college and I studied, well, I majored in, political science and economics and so forth, but I took classes from all kinds of disciplines, philosophy, history, languages, and so forth. And I think maybe the answer is a broader type of education becomes even more important going forward, because I not neither I nor most people, frankly, can really predict exactly where things are going to end up. And I think very narrow, very job-oriented training is perhaps what is a big risk now. And developing more adaptable skills, which train you to think in a certain way, and think and write and reason, are actually more important than ever, compared to learning this particular language, coding language, or learning this particular field of technology or something like that, which could just simply become obsolete. Um, so that's how I'm thinking about this. Maybe this is an opportunity for a renaissance and people studying philosophy and things like that, because we're going to need a lot of people with good judgment and good communication skills, and and how to sort of master the combination of man and machine, where it's not just the physical labor anymore that machines can do, but also the intellectual labor. And in a world like that, I'm not sure what particular discipline will really remain untouched. If you talk to people here, they say, well, the world's always going to need plumbers, because somebody's sink is going to get clogged, and AI is not going to solve that problem, and that may be true. So maybe some of the trades actually, which require skills and certifications, and can only be done really in person, will become valued in a different way, from a economics perspective, than they are at the moment. So being able to do certain things with your hands, whether it's again of a technical nature or of a creative nature might become more interesting. I actually saw a very interesting post on LinkedIn by somebody whose his child is, I think, also headed to college in the fall, and it seems like a marvelous kid with lots of skills and so forth. One of them being that he's a musician, um, and this father was writing about the idea that maybe the thing to go and focus on is actually the music which he would perform in, to a live audience, like that style, because people want that in-person human connection. um, so maybe that's the thing that he should actually double down and explore further, rather than some of the other fields that he's been thinking about. It's a very interesting period
Yeah,
to
yeah.
be at the cusp of adulthood, or thinking about what to study. I'm
Yeah,
not
I've
sure
been
about
I've
young
been
folks.
thinking about like when was sort of like going back because I again went to undergrad at a small business school, but the curriculum was around a liberal arts curriculum, right? So philosophy, history, biology, you had to take those classes, and that was the most fascinating and amazing experience to be able to be exposed to those types of things while studying economics and finance. And that has always stuck with me is that even in this moment you have to have that interdisciplinary humanities focused approach because ultimately what machines are going to do and have already done post the industrial revolution is make it that much more important for us to be humans.
Yeah.
And the era I keep thinking back to when the industrial revolution first broke through were the Luddites, and Luddites were sort of the elite craftsmen of British society who knew the arts of making clothes and things like that. And machines were compressing their labor and atomizing their work, fragmenting their tasks. Um, and there was great disruption and great political upheaval, including the fact that Luddites then had to be hanged because they were breaking machines, essentially, right? There were riots. And now we're entering an era where the skilled craftsmen are the white collar jobs, essentially that the machine is coming out for in the form of AI. And in a way, it also frees up humans from this being in front of a computer and a screen to process data and to be interpreting data to now going back to being a human. So
Mm.
one thing I often tell my junior colleagues now is that, being in the consulting space for over a decade, a lot of my time was spent in front of a computer processing data and some part in front of humans understanding what the problems were and trying to find solutions for that. But in many ways, I'm kind of jealous of the younger folks coming in right now because I'm like, much of the processing you do will be done by the machine. So you can actually be a lot more human and a lot more interdisciplinary in terms of figuring out what is driving the problem. And that approach only comes through an interdisciplinary education because by understanding human nature, anthropology, sociology, etc., you get an insight into human behavior and human societal sort of judgment that otherwise you don't get. So I agree with you on that, that's a particularly strong area to go after if you're thinking about studying these things.
And I think if you bring it back to Pakistan, where I think most of your audience is, I think they only have one proper liberal arts university, Habib in Karachi. And by the way, I've been very impressed by people from there. I've hired a few as well. Um, and maybe that's something we need more of. Not just one institution in the whole country that's focused on preparing people in this particular way, but many more of them.
And I think that's also the amazing part about that technology, right? Like, in a way, that decentralization, like, if 20, 30 years ago, you and I spoke and said, okay, if you wanted a really great liberal arts education focused in the humanities or focused on interdisciplinary subjects, you probably would name a bunch of Western universities and that's it.
Mm.
Because the curriculum was there, it was the professors were there, etc. Now, like as you said, in Pakistan, Habib is the only one, but a lot of that interdisciplinary content is on the internet, and AI is now making it possible for it to be translated in real time into low resource languages. Forget about high resource languages. So somebody sitting in Dera Ismail Khan who 30 years ago, their father may be interested in that subject, but never got that opportunity or that exposure. But the daughter of that father now has that ability or that opportunity to access that content even while sitting in Dera Ismail Khan. And to me, that is also very exciting. To your point, to your article, right? That a Manila 27 something year old with GPT-5 is very dangerous. It's the same thing, right? It's because that context and that information
Mm.
and that knowledge now is decentralized. And as a result, there's an equal playing field here.
Yes.
I don't know if you have more thoughts on this subject, but I was really, really intrigued by the piece. So I would recommend folks read it, check it out. It was fantastic reading that piece, fantastic talking to you. And I think as more and more of these breakthroughs come along, I'll bother you a bit more because this is a conversation I'm really interested in. And it's always fascinating because things are moving at the speed of light, so to speak.
Absolutely. And I want to say, I mean, if somebody is out there, thinking of building something, a solution, a service, whatever, that somehow, leverages AI and, globally distributed team of some kind, hit me up on LinkedIn. Let's talk about it.
Awesome. Well, hit up Adil on LinkedIn. I'll put his link as well on the description and always pleasure talking to you.
Thank you there.
Thanks.